Mesopotamia. And southern Mesopotamia is also very often called Lower Mesopotamia or Sumer, for the culture of the people, for the language and culture of the people who lived there, the Sumerians. Um, Now, in general, when we're talking about rivers or river-based cultures, like the many cultures of Mesopotamia, when you hear upper, that usually indicates upriver. So this means you have to have at least a general idea of what direction the river flows. In this case, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers flow from roughly north to south. For Mesopotamia, Upper Mesopotamia is in the north, Lower Mesopotamia is in the south. This may seem very intuitive. Why am I bothering with this? However, this is not always the case. Egypt uses the same upper-lower terminology, but because the Nile flows from the south to the north, Upper Egypt is the south of part of the country, and Lower Egypt is the north part of the country. This is why geography is important, people. So, just to keep this interesting. And these are some of the cities of the of this region that we will look at over the coming weeks. Also, just as a reminder, there is this chart of sort of periods and regional cultures in the Neolithic and Bronze Age, Mediterranean and Mesopotamia, that may be useful for you to review or to, kind of pull out and use as a quick cheat sheet for the next few lectures, because, the Ubaid period and the Jemdet Nasser period and the Akkadian period can all run together pretty quickly. I'm not going to talk through this. This is for your use and benefit as we move ahead in the class. So, what I'm going to talk about next are three of the late Neolithic cultures of Upper and Middle Mesopotamia. These are the Hassuna culture, the Samarra culture, and the Halaf culture. And these are important because they developed differently in the different cultures, but each of them developed some of the important features of architecture and culture that we're going to see taken further in the cities of southern Mesopotamia. All of these cultures at this point, at the end of the Neolithic period, are sedentary. They are agricultural. They have domesticated animals, supplemented by hunting, but they are, fully within the Neolithic Revolution. Also, before we move forward, if I have not already, I need to introduce this idea of a type site. The names of these cultures, Hassuna, Samarra, Halaf, and the other, many of the other things that we're going to talk about in the next couple of weeks, may seem to be named in a random and arbitrary sort of fashion. Well, what does it mean that something is the Hassuna culture? What does it mean that something's the Samarra culture? In many cases, archaeologically, cultures will be named after either the first site where a culture is recognized or a particularly important site to that particular archaeological culture. This is a thing called a type site. Down here, type site. That essentially it's the type. It sets the pattern for a particular culture. So, all of these, Hassuna, Samarra, Halaf, Ubaid culture, all of these are actually named for a type site. So this may hopefully avoid some confusion when we see, for example, objects from Telhasuna, um, that are from the Samara culture. These rough territories are, not set in stone. These are not hard boundaries, and cultures expand, contract, get adopted elsewhere. This is a guideline, not a hard state-based map, the way we might think about it in boundaries, national boundaries today. So, the Hasuna culture. This is in northeastern Mesopotamia up here. Um, and this is um, a less densely populated sort of culture. We have small houses made out of mud brick, or what is sometimes called tauf. We have trade to the north and south and east visible in the material record of the Hasuna culture. So we can see some of those objects here. Shell, here at number 1, that red stone is carnelian, which mostly comes from the Indian subcontinent, so very early on, quite long distance trade. And this is one of the cultures right on the edge of the zone where you can reliably depend on rainfall in this part of the world to provide enough moisture for agriculture, what's called rain-fed farming, or sometimes it's called dry farming. So this is some of the first steps of agriculture outside of the zone where it really developed. This is also, if you go back to the various charts of climate changes and weather patterns, you'll also notice that this is a period with, the beginnings of a decrease in rainfall. The Hasuna culture also, this is right on the edge of pottery production. Among other things, the Hasuna culture traded bitumen, or naturally occurring asphalt, to cultures to the south and west. So bitumen, now I'm sure you're familiar with asphalt as, oh yeah, it's that thing you pave a road with. This well, what's used industrially today is, chemically created, and from crude oil. But in its naturally occurring form, you do get pools and seeps of this naturally occurring petroleum in places that are where those deposits are very close to the surface, as they are in much of this part of the Middle East. So this is used widely in the ancient Near East, especially before pottery, but the invention and the spread of pottery is not something that ever stopped people from using bitumen. So this occurs in multiple places, some around the Dead Sea, but also in the period of the Hasuna culture, who used it, and it was used widely for waterproofing and sealing things, such as these baskets from what is today Bahrain. Hasuna pottery starts out with some noticeable similarities to some of the other pottery in the region. Dark painting on a light background. Early on, it is more complicated. We get more figures of animals, possibly people. I'm not sure what these they might be birds, they might be people. It's very abstracted, but we do have these antelopes with these wonderful wavy curly horns. Um, it tends to be more intricately painted early on. And over the course of a little over 1,000 years that this is an identifiable culture, the pottery actually gets simpler. It becomes unburnished. So this is, before it's fired, this would be rubbed very smooth with a very smooth stone so that the pottery would shine a little bit. It becomes unburnished and either incised, so taking a sharp stick and drawing things like these herringbone patterns, or, and this is the drawing of this pot, or it could be painted much more simply, just geometric designs. We also see people of the Hassuna culture making ceramic objects that are not vessels. So a jug or a bowl is a vessel. We see people of the Hassuna culture also making things like spindle whorls. This is essentially a tiny flywheel that goes on a stick, and which provides weight and momentum for spinning raw fiber, linen or wool, into string. It's an extremely simple and extremely elegant little bit of mechanical engineering. We also see people of the Hassuna culture making sling bullets. That's what A and C seem to be. A especially is, aerodynamically shaped. They wouldn't have necessarily thought about it in those terms, but the sling, the pre-rubber sling is not the slingshot with stretchy rubber bands that you may be familiar with. This is essentially two strings and a leather cup, small leather cup, that can be used to launch either a smooth rock or a bullet, especially made bullet like this, at really quite impressive force. A lead sling bullet, which those are made later, and a skilled user can, throw a lead sling bullet with about the same stopping power as a large modern handgun. Slings are, many of you may be familiar with them from the Old Testament stories of David. David and Goliath. That's what he used to, stop the warrior Goliath. So these are, pretty serious weapons, even though they seem quite innocuous to us at the moment. So, the Samara culture, and I am going to go through these relatively quickly. This is roughly contemporary with the Hassuna culture. Here, this is named for the site of Samara, which is better known as an Islamic period site. So 7th century AD and later. But in excavations of the Islamic periods, at the site of Samara, which is in eastern Syria today, excavators came across much, much earlier settlement evidence, and which was later corroborated by other sites, largely in this region. And since it was first seen at the site of Samara, it became the Samara culture. So the Samara culture is one of the first widespread users of man-made irrigation. On the right is an image of modern irrigation farming in Egypt, and frankly, in the ancient Near East, it probably would have looked relatively similar. Channels cut in the soil, allowing the fields to be flooded in a controlled sort of way. The rainfall patterns in Mesopotamia are such that they are not always conducive to agriculture. Um, when you combine the rainfall and snowmelt up at the headwaters of the Tigris and Euphrates, by the time they reach middle and southern Mesopotamia, it's actually harvest time. So if you want to make use of that water, because um, once you get out of the zone of rain-fed farming, you have to irrigate if you're going to get useful crop yields. Um, you have to plan ahead, and you have to use that water in a very deliberate sort of way. And I will talk a lot more about agriculture, since it is in many ways at the foundation of these cities in southern Mesopotamia. If you can't feed people, you can't have a high population density. So irrigation farming became the really the key to the incredible population density of southern Mesopotamia. And we know that the Samara culture, were doing this in part because archaeologists have found remains of flax seeds. You may be familiar with flax seeds from NOLA today, but flax is extremely useful plant. In fact, its current scientific name, Linum testissimum, essentially flax, the most extremely useful, alludes to that. It's grown for its seeds, which can be eaten as they are, and which are very nutritious. Those seeds can be pressed for oil. This is well before the domestication of the olive, and middle and southern Mesopotamia are not very good places for growing olive. So you can press the seeds for oil, and you can use the stalks of the plants for linen fiber. So it's an extremely useful plant. In that part of the world, it has to be irrigated. So other important developments of the Samara culture. At the site of Tel Aswan, we see the development of walled settlement. Walled cities are very much a thing in the large cities of southern Mesopotamia. We see a quirky cultural characteristic of the Samara culture is the strange shape that they use for their mud bricks. They use what are essentially cigar-shaped mud bricks. Imagine, if you will, let's say the coiled pots. I'm sure all of you tried to make a coiled clay pot in, elementary or middle school art class, or just playing around with Play-Doh yourselves. The mud bricks at many Samara culture sites are this, cigar shaped. They are roughly cylindrical. They are much longer than they are wide, and they look kind of like the same kind of coil, or at least the beginnings of the same kind of coil that you might use to make a pot if you are, not using a fast potter's wheel. So this is a really interesting connection between pottery and architecture in this culture. We also see the early developments of two of the typical kinds of house construction, or just like typical plans for buildings. We'll see it beyond houses in southern Mesopotamia. So these two things, they're called T-shaped houses and tripartite houses. These are two characteristics that can go together. So these are T-shaped houses. They have one part that is, narrow, essentially one part that is narrower than the other. So it looks, and if you were to flip this over, you would see how it looks like a very chubby letter T. There are also tripartite houses, three-part houses. that have a central hallway or central, a large central room that's usually longer than it is wide, with two banks of rooms off of that central hallway. Here, this house on the end, we have the very beginnings of a central hallway. It's very, very skinny, but there are, this is the early beginning of a central hallway with rooms off of either side of it. And then it also has this long corridor at the T-shaped end. These houses, we are pretty sure, generally had a second floor. The thickness of the walls, built with these cigar-shaped mud bricks, almost guarantee that there is would be a second story. They're far too thick to be worth building unless it was trying to support a second story. And these are very often buttressed. So if you see these little nubs sticking off the outsides of these houses, this is not just aesthetics. This is, in fact, this helps keep the walls up. Although these buttresses will, in fact, be evolved for aesthetic purposes later on, and we'll talk about that in a bit. The other important thing that we see developing in the Samara culture so alongside that irrigation, which really is a communal project, it's the building irrigation canals is just too big a job for one person to do it and be worth doing it. But if it's an entire community irrigating all of their fields, then you have both enough people to do the job in an efficient sort of way, and you have a benefit to the whole community. We also, at Samara culture sites, see communal storage. So I will talk a lot more about communal storage. So these are just a couple examples of Samara culture pottery. You can see, I'm sure you can, see some similarities to the Hassuna culture, the dark on light patterns, these very lively little bird designs combined with abstract and geometric patterns, these arrows and, little things that look like they could be arrows or bird tracks. And then anthropomorphic vessels like this one. This would have been a large jug. It's only the top third or so that survived, and really only a fragment of that. All the rest of this is a later conservation edition. So you get some idea of the whole of the jug, but it's painted with the face of a woman. And it's a very engaging image, even if it's not, naturalistic. We've got the hair here in these zigzags. We've got this, wonderfully elegant unibrow that may be something that has never been said before. A little nose sticking out. She's got, what maybe makeup or jewelry or, an indication of tattoos of some sort. And these really interesting eyes. And we will talk about the emphasis on the eyes as a long-term theme in Near Eastern art. But this is one place where we see it quite early. Samara culture also made early and interesting use of a material called alabaster. Alabaster is a generic name for a couple of different kinds of decorative stone. Alabasters are very, very soft. In this part of the world, in the wider Middle East, Egypt and Mesopotamia especially, alabaster is usually a kind of calcite. So a chemical cousin to limestone and other stones that they were making plaster out of. alabaster is so soft it can be carved just with a regular knife, and it's very often very attractively banded with different shades of dark and light, darker and lighter material. So this is just a tiny little alabaster vessel, and a small figurine, also made out of alabaster. And you can see it's got these eyes. Those are separate pieces that have been stuck into the face of this figure with bitumen, and then the areas of the eyebrows are also darkened with bitumen. We've seen this emphasis on the eyes before, um, especially at Jericho with those with some of those Jericho plastered skulls, and the plaster constructed statues from Ein Ghazal. So here's one of those Ein Ghazal plaster statues. You can see those, this is all just sort of various modeled masses, but they've gone and they've outlined the eyes. And then later we see the same thing. This is a ceramic figurine from Chogamami, which is a site in the southeastern part of the Samara culture. And you can see these like almost cowrie shell shaped eyes on this head that is pretty representative of the figurines that they're making there. And so, you can compare these modeled and then incised and painted eyes from that jar, from that Samara culture jar. And this is one of those cases where Samara culture, but found at Tel Hassuna. Um, you can kind of trace a long line from the plaster modeled skulls from Jericho, and this example, which is in the Ashmolean Museum, actually has surviving cowrie shells inlaid in the eye sockets of the skull, to the inlaid alabaster eyes, outlined with bitumen, to these eyes on the that look sort of vaguely like cowrie shells, on these figurines from Chogamami and this vase from Tel Hassuna. Okay. Finally, the Halaf culture. Um, this is another. This is up here in northwestern Mesopotamia. So the Hassuna culture northeast, the Samara culture sort of central, and very much out of the rain-fed farming zone, and then the Halaf culture farther to the west. Göbekli Tepe, that we talked about a couple of lectures, a couple of lectures ago, is over here, right on the edge of southern Anatolia and far northern Mesopotamia. So some of the important sites of the Halaf culture are Tel Arpachia and Tel Brak. And both of these we will talk about at greater length over the next couple of lectures. In the Halaf culture, we see some other things that, again, get further developed in the major cities of southern Mesopotamia. We start to see, specialized like ritual and monumental architecture. We start to see an extensive trade network, north and south, that has some interesting signs of centralized control. And finally, we start to see the beginnings of record keeping and administration through the use of seals. And all of these things will be very important in coming lectures and coming centuries. So, Teller Pachaya has a fascinating history, both architecturally and, as I will get into in lecture 5, politically. So this is a view of the site in more recent times. It's been excavated several times, beginning in the 1930s with the husband of Agatha Christie, an archaeologist named Max Mallowan, and then further at several points in the 1970s and more recently. Buildings here were, again, mud brick, tauf, on stone foundations. The stone foundations survive much better than the mud brick superstructures. If you remember from earlier lectures, mud brick needs careful maintenance. It can last for centuries as long as you're taking care of it. And the two most interesting, from our point of view, parts of the site are two phases. The earlier one has these two buildings called tholoi, with this round area and a long rectangular room attached to it. And then over top of these tholoi were built in the next period, were built what is often called the burnt house. And I'll talk about these in more detail in a minute. So these are reconstruction drawings of this earlier phase tholos buildings. A tholos. This is terminology that is borrowed from much later buildings in Greece. These are not related. They are similar only in shape. They're not used in the same way. Tholoi in the Greek world were used for a variety of different kinds of tombs. These seem to be domestic. So we've got this round section that is the tholos itself, and then this long rectangular room that is attached that's called a dromos. There don't seem to be any more than two of them at a time at Halaf culture sites. And Arpachaya, Tel Arpachaya is sort of our example that we're looking at. They're some sort of special building, but they did have domestic features. So what that means, cookware, remains of cookware would be found in them, signs of cooking, other like signs that people lived in them. We don't know what set these apart from the other families in the village. We don't know, what the significance of this architectural form is compared to the other rectangular houses in the village at that point. But we do know that they were important. They're quite large, 6 meters in diameter for the tholos, and then, half again as long for the dromos. It's a big building. And we know that they were important because, and at Arpachaya they remained important, because the next architectural phase was built in ways that respect the shapes of these buildings. So let's look at that. So this is a image of the site taken in the 1930s. Those first excavations by Max Mallowan, and this is the tholos and the dromos here of that earlier phase building underneath the burnt house. So TT7 is the earlier phase. This is technically TT6. At Tel Arpachaya, Max Mallowan numbered the phases of the site with the first one starting at the top of the hill. He was using the Turkish nomenclature. So rather than tel, he was using tepe. So TT, top of tepe. So the first phase was TT1. The Tholos buildings are TT7. The slightly later buildings are part of TT6. So this is the burnt house. It was built in the phase after the Tholos. So it's built in TT6. And even though the Tholos itself was not in use, they'd, demolished the upper walls of this. The long room of the burnt house actually, sits directly on top of the Tholos, of the dromos of that particular Tholos building. So, those foundations were visible when this was being built, and it was still apparently important enough that, they oriented important parts of this later building with respect to the earlier phases. I'm going to talk a lot more about this site and the burnt house in the next lecture. So, this is also a period where we start to see the use of stamp seals really coming into its own. So we're combining communal storage with a method of record keeping. And that's really interesting. So it's not just that this was, there for everyone that grain and whatever else was stored in these communal storerooms was just there for everyone to use willy-nilly. It was also, intended to be kept track of. So seals begin to be used around this period, and they continue throughout Mesopotamian history as incredibly important personal objects, as bureaucratic objects, as objects that are key to identity and bureaucratic control and the creation of writing in general. So this is one that's slightly earlier and slightly further east. This is a Halaf stamp seal. No, I'm sorry, this is the period we're talking about. Excuse me. So it's roughly, a lot of scholars think that this is essentially a lizard, with its tail up here and and a little nub of a head down here, and then this is the scaly pattern on its back. The object itself is a seal. An impression of the seal is often called a sealing. Sealing, not like what is above you in a room, but a thing that has been sealed. This is a slightly later one, an Ubaid stamp seal from southern Mesopotamia. This has a little goat on it with a leaf up here, and you carve into the seal. You make the negative version of the image you want to create, and then it can be stamped, or shortly after this they start making them in cylinder shapes, so it can just be rolled across wet clay or plaster. So these are generally have some kind of loop on the back, so that you can wear them. Similarly with cylinder seals. Cylinder seals generally have a perforation through the middle of the seal, and they are often worn on a little cord around the wrist, or like a necklace around the neck, and they can be used to identify and tamper-proof many different kinds of goods, and actually also entire storerooms, by taking wet clay and covering the top of a jar, or the seam, the crack of a door, or after writing becomes a thing, used to seal documents, just by impressing the design into wet clay, so that it could cover like a seam or a string that binds, two things together. And these sealings are often kept even after the seal itself was broken and they're removed. they can be, tallied. This is a early form of record keeping. So like, if you, let's say your family seals up 25 jars of, grain in the communal storeroom, and you have to leave the ceiling behind. They're all sealed with your personal steel, but you have to leave the ceiling behind. Then the community can see like who's taking how many jars of grain. Are you taking your quota? Have you tampered with somebody else's grain? These are really quite key to the development of administration and the development of private property. Um, so all that bureaucracy that the University of Illinois is so infamous for, it starts right here. Once upon a time, 6000 BC in Mesopotamia, somebody comes up with seals, and now I have to go talk to the registrar. So these are some examples of how an object may be sealed with wet clay and a stamp seal. So these are mostly from Egypt, but the techniques hold true throughout everywhere in the Mediterranean that was using seals. So you put a little lid on your jar, and then you can cover it all with wet clay. You can also say cover it with leather and string, and then have a little glob of wet clay just over the knot where you've tied the string. This is a Egyptian jar that is in fact never unsealed, and in fact there are still objects in there. This is at the University of Pennsylvania, and they did CT scanning to figure out what's inside, and it's little beads or something that actually might have been a child's rattle. And these are two ancient Near Eastern sealings that have partially survived, that probably covered a jar or perhaps a door, the seam of a door. So other characteristics of the Halaf culture, extremely intricate painted ceramics. Late Halaf ceramics are incredibly beautifully decorated. The other Halaf ceramics are, perhaps not so comprehensively covered with multiple colors of patterns. This is what's called polychromy or polychrome pottery. In reds, browns, blacks, whites, geometric designs, but also animals. We have this little sherd here with a little water bird, and that uses the white background, the dark paint, and then also a couple different colors to decorate the pottery. It's dark brown and this lighter red. We've got this very amusing snake here with a little tongue sticking out. They really liked having both eyes visible on things they paint on their pottery. This is really interesting because when we talk about Tel Brak, I'll also talk about the Temple of the Eyes at Tel Brak, and which takes that emphasis on the eyes in art throughout the ancient Near East and to its logical conclusion. And so what's there is just pairs of eyes. And I'll talk about this in the near future. We also see some definite similarities to parts of Anatolia. If you think back to Çatalhöyük, some of the female figurines that have been found there, the people of the Halaf culture used some very similar figurines that really emphasize female fertility. There are very likely physical economic and cultural links between the Halaf culture and southern Anatolia in this period. After looking at those three cultures, the Hassuna culture, the Samarra culture, and the Halaf culture, we're going to head all the way south, down to southern Mesopotamia, the area that's called Sumer, and the very first of these beginnings of urbanism in southern Mesopotamia with the Ubaid culture. This is named after Tel Ubaid. And this is, so if these cultures to the north in the late Neolithic period really developed different elements that would be identified with southern Mesopotamian urbanism, this down here in the south is where these things really come together, and also come together with the kind of population density and the kind of durability of sites that lets us really confidently say that these are cities. So these cultures were, of course, all in contact with each other. That's why I was, saying earlier that these bubbles here are extremely porous. It's in southern Mesopotamia that we see the necessary population density develop. And it comes about among the people called the Sumerians. Sumerian is a later term. It is a term that some of the people of the sort of central and northern parts of Mesopotamia call the people in the south, and a couple thousand years later than what we're talking about, but it's the name that has stuck. The Sumerians are one of the first cultures to develop writing. They and ancient Egypt developed writing at about the same time. We see in Sumeria the beginnings of truly centralized authority, and monumental architecture, large-scale administration that all really endure in ways that then expand back into the middle and northern parts of Mesopotamia, which is, part of why this is such a key place for the development of urbanism. So changes in the climate continue to be important in this period. So in the late Neolithic, the Near East was having a really good good climactic period, with about twice as much rainfall as the area experiences today, and a wide expansion of woodlands, forested steppes and lakes. More, this is the one of the wettest periods in that part of the world ever. Over the next 4,000 years, it becomes warmer and drier. And around the time that we'll be, talking about, around 3000 BC, the climactic conditions are actually relatively similar to what they are now, at least relative to previous periods. So the other major difference that we need to keep in mind is that the Persian Gulf was actually, the coast of the Persian Gulf was much farther north at the end of the Neolithic period, and really until well into historical periods, than it is today. So this is roughly the modern coastline of the Persian Gulf. However, around 5000 BC, 5000 BP, 5,000 years before present, so around 3000 BC, the cities of Ur and Uruk and Eridu were actually on the coast. And this is the result of silt, of the huge amounts of soil and other materials carried down the lengths of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers and dumped into the Persian Gulf over time. So this is, the first cities of Mesopotamia would actually have been not just on the coast, but in this huge zone of interspersed, pockets, relatively arid pockets of less watered soil, and brackish marshland, similar to what's found near the modern coast of the Persian Gulf. And this is a modern picture of two of the residents of what are kind of colloquially called the marsh Arab communities of the Persian Gulf coast, in that kind of landscape. This is an area where, fresh water mixes with salt water of the Gulf. It's incredibly full of life. Many of these sort of intertidal marsh zones are, extremely fertile. But it's also can be very wet. It can be very treacherous. The flooding and the tides work together in weird ways. It is also the home of one of the oldest continuous architectural traditions in the world. And this is not the mud brick architecture we've been looking at. This is reed architecture. This is a very perishable kind of building. And one of these types of building is shown up here. It's sometimes called Mudif architecture or Sarifa architecture for these buildings built with reeds. And this is the sort of the most one of the most elaborate kinds of buildings. It's called a Mudif. This is a community meeting hall and guest room in this part of what is today southern Iraq. And in fact, we have images from ancient Mesopotamian seals of buildings that look almost exactly like this, with these tall pillars of amalgamated reeds as the support and the skeleton for the building. These panels, these woven panels of more open reed mesh that allow for the circulation of air. It's really striking how much these look like what we see on seal impressions from 5,000 years ago. So this is actually on the UNESCO list of intangible cultural heritage of humanity. So, first city. Ta-da! Middle of the fourth lecture, and we finally get to an actual city. This is the site of Eridu. It looks, desolate today. The changes, the draining of the marshes that used to stretch, well up, even with the later sedimentation of the outlet of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, pushing back the coast of the Persian Gulf, there was a great deal of marshland up until even as late as the 1980s, when Saddam Hussein thought that the marsh dwellers of Iraq were a likely breeding ground for rebel movements, and actually through dams and all sorts of authoritarian environmental manipulation, actually drained a lot of the marshes of southern Iraq. So the city of Eridu is in this, arid zone today, but originally this would have been in this, highly fertile um, riverine marsh on the edges of the ancient coast of the Persian Gulf. This is just one of seven tells. So 7 smaller tells around this area. And we're mostly going to be looking at the largest of them, which has the religious center, one of the religious centers of the city. Um, So, traditionally, Eridu is the place that later Mesopotamian cultures identified as the first place to be a city. One of their creation stories, which was the versions of which we have from around 650 BC, so thousands of years later, says, a reed had not come forth, a tree had not been created, a house had not been made, a city had not been made, then Eridu was made. So here, this is the first place. There has been a great deal of speculation about who the first inhabitants of Eridu were. There are scholars who think that this, especially based on the importance of irrigation, that this may have been in part inhabited by a migration of people from the Samara culture, and either or the Samara culture, but perhaps also the a culture we have not talked about, the Haji Muhammad culture, which existed to the east of the sort of central Mesopotamia. But however it was first inhabited, and there are other ideas that perhaps people migrated up from the south, from the area around Bahrain, which the people of these cities, Eridu or Uruk, called Dilmun. Because there are also some stories about this area being populated by the people of Dilmun. This is however it was originally settled, around 5400 BC, Eridu was first settled on a previously uninhabited site, and it lasted as an urban space until it was finally abandoned around 650 BC in what's called the Neo-Babylonian period. So that's, not quite 5,000 years, 4,800-ish. That's a pretty good run for an urban area. Even if for its last 1,000 years or so, it seems to have been very sparsely populated, mostly by the religious personnel of the various temples. So not only is this the place that multiple cultures of ancient Mesopotamia identified as the first city, it's also the first place that they identified with a king. And this is based on a corpus of texts called the Sumerian king lists. The most important structure, which we'll take a much closer look at, is the Temple of Enki. Enki is one of the primordial deities of Mesopotamia, one of the handful of deities that in a variety of ways, in a variety of stories, created the world. He's the Lord of sweet water, and specifically like the water under the ground. So like the aquifer, the not just the river, but the underground aquifer of fresh water, which, here in this part of Mesopotamia, begins to, hit and mingle with the salt water of the Persian Gulf. And in fact, some of those creation stories talk about first sweet water mingling with salt water as the two primordial deities. Tiamat, the chaotic deity of salt water, the mother of all life, essentially. So we know that the city had an extensive system of irrigation canals. Um, and this is, one of the first places where we really see the kinds of social, political, and religious institutions that, point to a centralization of authority in a variety of different ways. And this is especially important because it's an early place where it persists. So if you remember, me talking about Mlynecka, which may have been many times the size of Eridu in terms of population, um, that only lasted about 300 years. And, when you compare that to, 4,800, give or take, that's a pretty big difference. So there isn't a good reconstruction of what Eridu looked like in the 5th millennium BC. This is a satellite image of Mound 1, one of those 8 small tells that seem to um, have made up important parts of the city of Eridu. This is the site of the Temple of Enki, and this is the area of the city that has received the most attention. Um, and in fact, on the previous slide, that strange black and white, strange skinny black and white photograph showed was a composite photo of different layers found in that temple. So this is a perhaps more comprehensible drawing. This is an entire sequence of temples to Enki. It's kind of collectively called the House of the Aqueduct. The earliest were built around 5,500 BC. It's this tiny little building down here with a tiny little niche. And over the course of 16 levels, 16 massive layers of temples built on top of and around each other, eventually this became one of the earliest of a like classic um, um, classic Mesopotamian architectural form called a ziggurat. So a ziggurat is not a temple. The temple sits on top of a ziggurat. A ziggurat is essentially it's a platform. It is an artificial mountain that is made to raise a temple above the surrounding landscape. And it is, in some ways, a deliberate tell. So as these mud brick temples were rebuilt over the course of 2,500 years, they formed the core of this mound that is Mound 1 at Eridu. This is an artist's reconstruction from the 1980s of what that may have looked like in its final form. What would be up here, Temple 1, again, they're numbering from the first thing they excavated down to the last thing they excavated, Temple 16. Mesopotamian temples are actually oriented with their corners to the cardinal directions. So in many, modern religious settings, in Christian settings, they are often oriented to the east, toward the rising sun as a symbol of resurrection. The prayer niche in mosques oriented in the direction of Mecca. And for ancient Near Eastern temples, they actually used the corners as the points of orientation. So the corners are oriented north, south, east, west, rather than the mass of the buildings. We usually think about orienting the walls to the cardinal directions, and they oriented the corners. So the site of Eridu was excavated in the 1940s by an Iraqi archaeologist, Fuad Safar, and a British archaeologist named Seton Lloyd. And it's really interesting that Lloyd himself, said that Safar was in charge. This is very early to have a local person, an Iraqi, in charge of the excavations, as opposed to a colonizer. Pottery studies, a big comprehensive pottery study was done in the 1950s and 60s by a scholar named John Oates. And that study really set the chronology for the Ubaid and other early historical periods for southern Mesopotamia. So this is the place. This temple really is the site that sets, what we it's the scale that other archaeologists measure against in a lot of ways for the historical periods and the end of prehistory in southern Mesopotamia. These are two more photographs. Again, 1940s. I apologize. This is parts of the sort of middle period temples. You can see they've cleared away some of the debris and melted mud brick into the parts that were deliberately buried to get a better idea of the architecture. And this is that composite photo again that has the earliest temple, Temple 16, down here, and you can see this is one of the local people they had work on the excavation, and just how small this first religious space is compared to the massive site of the final period of temple building 2,500 years later. And this is a better photograph of that first temple, level 16. So this does, look very much like a tiny version of that T-shaped house plan. So you've got a little bit that, sticks off one side, just a niche. That is a plinth that would have probably held the statue of a god. We've got an offering table here in the middle. We've got these little buttresses helping keep the walls up. And then, this larger space that's roughly at 90 degrees to this niche. And then we can see, how these spaces compare over time. So level 16 down here, altar, the niche, offering table. There was a little oven outside, so communal dining seems to be part of this from the very beginning. In later phases, we see a need to turn 90 degrees. So the offering table is often, not always, but often in line with the altar, but the entrance, you enter in the middle and you have to turn 90 degrees to see the altar with the statue of the deity, and then turn back to leave things on the offering table. So these are reconstruction drawings, and then these are the plans of what was actually found in the excavation itself. So with the long-term evolution of the Temple of Enki in mind, let's roll things back and look at the early phases of this temple, and start in the very beginning in Temple 16. This tiny little one-room niche with its altar for the statue of the god here, its little offering table here, and its similarity to those T-shaped houses from the Samara culture that we looked at earlier in the lecture. Now, many cultures take their domestic architecture, what the basic shape of a house is, and adapt it for their earliest specifically religious buildings. It happens here in Mesopotamia. It happens in Greece in ways we will look at in future lectures. It happens with the very earliest religious architecture in the Roman culture, and it happens here in Mesopotamia. And this is because for many cultures, a temple is not just a place to worship, and in fact, in some cultures, a temple is not actually, the interior of a temple at least, is not actually a place to worship. It is literally the house of the god. And in Mesopotamia, that idea that a temple is the house of the god really gets elaborated well beyond architecture. We will look at this more in this lecture and the next one, but really a temple was the household of the god, with the priest and other temple personnel acting as members of the deity's household, as their servants, as their household, manager. The city that, most Mesopotamian cities would have a major temple, one temple at the sort of the heart of the city, although there might be other temples elsewhere. But that foundational temple, that most important temple in a Mesopotamian city, was the house of their main deity. And the city itself was considered the property of the god. I'll talk more about how this interacts with kingship and administration in Mesopotamian cities in a bit. But this idea of the temple as the house of the god really gets taken to the extreme in some ways in ancient Mesopotamia. So, if we go back and we look at some of these very early architectural forms, like I mentioned, the tripartite houses, T-shaped houses, we can see the characteristics of these combined in the temples of the early cities of southern Mesopotamia. So here at A, this is a large Ubaid, early Ubaid period house from the earliest site where we have seen Ubaid, where archaeologists have found Ubaid culture remains, although it's not the first site where the Ubaid culture was recognized. That was Tel el Ubaid. This is Tel Ueli, and this is one of the earliest known Ubaid tripartite houses. So it has this central core, this central room here with two banks of rooms off either, with a bank of room off of either side. Those are the three parts of the tripartite house. Large central room, smaller sets of rooms on either side. And you can see that is the form that you can see most clearly in the later levels of the temple of Enki at Eridu. This is the analogous to that central hallway, and then here is the main entrance with the stairs, the offering table, the altar with the statue of the gods, and little rooms off to either side of that main hallway. These are T-shaped houses from Tel Abada, north of southern Mesopotamia, and you can see here in this large central one at this big A, how that tripartite formula and the T-shaped formula can be combined. So we have the main, several of these houses have a main central room with a T-shaped corridor or extensions to either side, and then banks of rooms here and here. The largest of these buildings at Tel Abada also combines this T-shape and tripartite formulas with this large corridor here, and then two other wings of rooms to either side. And, a bit of architectural inception, another T-shaped room here. And you can see these combined in different ways. Here, these are turned in each of these wings of rooms off of this central corridor. Some of these have been modified over the course of time, like this central hallway in A, that's probably been built over or subdivided. But these are flexible formulas that we see put into place in the temple architecture of southern Mesopotamia. So this, begs another question. Why does the earliest urbanism often involve the construction of temples? So ultimately, there isn't really any meaningful separation of religion from the rest of life in the ancient world. Deities were, for most people, part of their community in a very real way. It's perhaps like having an extremely wealthy, extremely powerful, extremely unpredictable neighbor who, essentially owns most of the town, even if you only ever see, their staff. Think how Mr. Burns in The Simpsons, although he's more of a part of the community than, many of these entities in the ancient world. Ultimately, what we would consider religion in the ancient world is very much a variety of ways of keeping a good relationship between people at many levels of the community and the supernatural. You can do that on a personal level. You probably should in the ancient world do that on a household level. You would do that on a community level. You could even do that on a larger regional level. This was simply part of life. The same way that we, keep good relationships with our neighbors, as a, matter of being a decent citizen. This is, very different from that sort of set asideness of religion for many people in the modern world. Thinking about, what religion does on a city level, however, religion is a form of ideology, and I've got a definition of ideology up here. It's a system of ideas that, in this definition, it forms the basis of many things other than just economic and political theory and policy. It can form the basis of social relationships or basis of, urbanism. And so, faith can create really important connections, both within a community and in the all-important relationship between the supernatural, meaning everything beyond human power, which was, in a world before modern medicine and modern weather forecasting and, all sorts of the conveniences that we take for granted, there was a lot that is beyond human power in the ancient world. And, that feeling of connection, both between the individual and, the world beyond their control, but also between members of the community through participating in rituals together, is a really important part of binding a community together today as well as in the ancient world. Think about, the camaraderie of going to football games with people and participating, with a large crowd in these, things repeated in time and repeated in space. You are there in, Memorial Stadium chanting the Illini cheer and watching the marching Illini at halftime, just like, generations before you for, for over 100 years. And it creates, a community, not just among people at, the game together with you at any, that present moment, but also, ultimately a community into the depth of time. You have done this as perhaps your, great grandparents did in the, I don't know, 19 teens, and, perhaps as your children or grandchildren will do if they also come to the University of Illinois. So, this profound feeling of connection that extends in multiple directions. This is, also then an institutional mechanism by which an elite can, take those feelings of faith and community and put them to use. Gains in prestige, gains in material wealth, control, cooperation. Once you've got that Illini community spirit, perhaps you will go, work for the fundraising phone bank for the University of Illinois, or donate as an alum when you're an alumnus and, have a real job. This is, or, say you make a heck of a lot of money and you donate a very large part of your wealth to the university and, they name a building after you. This is, still, this, emotional connection and feelings of community are still, leveraged by communities to, build stability and wealth. So this is also, especially in the context of the ancient world, a way to not just bring people together in terms of creating gains for a small elite, but it also brings people together in ways that can benefit the community as a whole, in, very practical ways. Remember, this is a period before money. So, wealth is measured in labor, that can be commanded, or coerced, or, brought to bear on a situation. It is, the goods that you can give back to the community or the temple. And, we can go out and do the large scale irrigation work that is often tied to temples as institutions in ancient Mesopotamia. It can be brought to bear on bringing people together to form an army if you need to defend the city. And this is done through ritual, which often includes feasting. If you think back to the last lecture where I talked about, the slightly whimsical but actually kind of compelling argument that, maybe it was beer that brought about large-scale that brought about agriculture, because alcohol was part of, feasts and ceremonies of commemoration and funerals in the ancient Near East. This is an important way of bringing people together. Think about, all the friends that you have had dinner with. Think about, God help me, fraternity and sorority parties that involve, feasting and other shared rituals. And on the other side, this kind of community is also built through shared taboos, through, things that you are not allowed to do, through the fear of missing out. Think about the last party you may have gone to where, like, you don't really maybe want to go at, the beginning of the evening, but like, oh, all my friends are going, and like, I don't want to miss out. This is social pressure. Social pressure is a kind of taboo. Um, Not wanting to miss out, not wanting to be thought of as different, not wanting to transgress the boundaries set out in by the community in one way or another. So, other ways that these early cities really came together um, also involved the large scale organization of agriculture. So we've been, the last couple of